share this screen. All right, can you all see that pretty clearly, generally?
Sure can, it's great.
Excellent. All right, so good morning, first of all. Uh, I am sitting here on a lovely, humid, and very hot day in central Pennsylvania in Athelmark. I'm from the Shire of Nithgard. My name is Lord Cass, and this class is related to theory and method in the SCA and how you can use it to um, flesh out your research if you've gotten that critique. Um, so mundane, starting in the SCA, research is one of my primary topics. I specifically work in cordials and very often without extents. Mundanely, I am a professional archaeologist and I'm a trained anthropologist. And one of the reasons why I am teaching this class, you may be asking, because it seems quite a chunky topic, is that I came to the realization that I was using a lot of professional topics and professional methods on my research or within my research while I was working on my SCA projects. And I specifically, whether it's I would get the feedback that I needed to flesh out my research, or I would hit dead ends. Like you're trying to chase down a lead, and you can't quite find that one source or the one thing. Like how you would want to maybe look for it, but you can't find it, and it's like leaving this section of your research kind of tenuous. You have no extent, like I do with my Krupnik research, or you're finding like when I found really excellent academic sources, and they're super interesting, and I have no idea how to use them. Like I have no idea to put them how to put them into context. I was running into all of these situations, and I was generally coping with them with things I learned through my master's education. And as I went through, as I realized this, really, I really felt strongly that there needed to be a class where I could pass this sort of information along in this kind of experience, because I feel that one of the aspects that led me to leave my academic career and work professionally was the level of kind of gatekeeping regarding information. And that was quite frustrating for me. And I feel that one doesn't need to spend hundreds of dollars on textbooks or get a university education to become a very good and effective researcher. So ultimately, this is my attempt to share what I think my strengths as a researcher are with you guys, so that they may become your own. And finally, this class is geared towards folks, whether you're in the laurel level, whether you are a first researcher, whether you are kind of somewhere in the middle like I am. It's ultimately geared towards somebody who is frustrated and maybe is ready to trash their project and quit A&S completely. And I've heard some of my friends who have gotten into A&S, or some of my colleagues who have worked through professional projects, that they're just like, I'm ready to get out of it, I'm frustrated, I don't know where to go. Don't do that. Hopefully this class can help you, or at least give you a new perspective on how to manage the kind of work that you're doing in a way that you can get what you want out of your work. Because ultimately this is art, and if your art doesn't please you, if you aren't happy while you're doing this, something has to change. And truthfully, this kind of method and theory is often one of those like scary class titles you see on like a course catalog, and you're like, oh my, it's a mandatory class and nobody has fun in it. But really what it is there to be is a set of tools in your toolbox, and it gives you a sort of framework that you can work from when you start to ask your research questions. We all have opinions, especially about our specialties in research and what we want to do with them. But what turns an opinion into an interpretation, really, is the structure that you give it as you're creating your research. Like these are the facts that help you elaborate your premise further from just a starting point. And when you assert that premise, it is really interpretive. So, for example, if I were to say, all liquors made in a certain SCA time period are honey based, that's an interpretation one way or another from my own understanding of the information that's coming through. Realistically, that's just a statement. It doesn't have anything to back it up yet. The framework that backs it up is formed by these methods and theories, and you can kind of think of it like a leaf on a branch.
Okay.
Could all folks mute, please?
You do those?
Thank you. Here we go. All right. Sorry. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Let me just get out of. All right. Thanks for your patience, everyone. So you want to think of this as like a leaf growing on a branch. You have this leaf, it needs something to grow from. Your interpretation, your premise on your research is that leaf, and you need something to give your information a structure so you can make your point about what your project is going to be. So ultimately, what we're going to be doing here is we have 4 sets of questions, and each set has a different point of view that it wants you to consider about your research topic. And I'm not going to be reading you a theory textbook. I'm not going to be putting definitions up on slides. We would all dislike that and have a bad time this morning. So this is really structured. This is going to be structured with, we'll have these sets of questions and we'll have an object, and we'll talk about what these questions want you to look at and want you to consider about an object. You may notice as we go through these that sometimes these sets of questions argue with each other, and that is really okay. A lot of these schools of thought developed in opposition or in support of each other. And that kind of call and response within academia is really common. And in some ways, maybe they'll counter each other, maybe they'll enhance each other, but they all want you to consider a specific perspective on any given object, and they think it's really important that you do. And I agree with them. None of these are wrong per se, but they have their positives and their negatives within their limitations. So let's start with our first set of questions, shall we? This is a Baumgartner altarpiece by Albrecht Dürer. It's within period. It's a Northern Wren piece, and I'm sure most folks are familiar with Albrecht Dürer. He was a painter and specifically famous for his woodcuts. And working that within mass printing. So we've got this altarpiece, and let's consider our first set of questions and what we can ask of it. The first set wants you to consider the overarching structure, so to speak, of what created this object. The thing that it really wants you to know that the thing that created this piece of art is important, and not the artist here. We'll get to that in a little bit. It wants you to consider the culture. So the religion that is present within the artwork. Would it give rise to this kind of artwork? Is there something in particular about the language? So in this case, German, that would be easily described about this object? And indeed, would this piece of art be representative of, say, a German art tradition? It also wants you to consider another lovely German word, the zeitgeist, or the movement that this piece of art came from. This is the Northern Renaissance period piece. What does it have? It wants what can we ask of it that is in common with the Northern Renaissance? And we are looking at knights on either side of this. We are looking at, this is an altarpiece that's going to be up at the very front of a church. Uh, can we one thing we can ask is, what's universal in this that we can pull out of it and talk in a general sense to describe this art piece? And if we do that, can we put it in a category? Can we, call it a typical Northern Wren piece? Can we call it a typical or not even Can we call it a typical Northern Christian piece, or a Northern Catholic or Protestant piece? This first set of questions really wants you to consider the broadest context within which that you can ask these questions of this object. And ultimately, this makes for very good background research. So maybe I've mentioned a couple times the bulking up or fleshing out your research as a common critique. So perhaps this is one of the best ways to go about starting at the beginning with your research and beginning to ask different or more thorough questions to help broaden the context of the object that you're trying to work with. Now, there is a second set, because this is, first set the objects. Now, we've considered the questions we can ask about the structure. What can we ask about the object itself, though? Because, the movement that creates an artistic dialogue, or a period in time, such as the Romantic period, or the high medieval period, they create a lot of things come out of those periods. Can we say that all of the things that come out of, for example, the Northern Renaissance are the same? Do they have a universal, is it fair to say that universally all objects that come out of a specific period are the same? And this second set of questions wants you to consider the object on its own rights, not just the background. It doesn't want you to overgeneralize. Yeah, as I wrote up there, the object is not just a product of the thing. It's not. There's a person who created this. Albrecht Dürer created this. There is a school of style that he came from. So what can we talk about that in terms of this altarpiece? Can we talk about, is this typical of Dürer's altarpieces? What can we talk about specific that are the techniques used in this altarpiece? And is it the same or different from other altarpieces done by other artists, or even those just done by Albrecht Dürer? This second set of questions refines the first, right? It doesn't want you to go too broad when you look at whatever you are trying to create. And this first set is really particularly helpful for how can we start in the broadest sense of our research and plant our feet firmly in the known. Because a lot of what we do as SCA reenactors is we recreate things that we may not necessarily we may not know exactly how they were made. And so rooting ourselves in the known, how the artists like to paint, how the religion, the area, the structures that created the culture that gave rise to this style of object, is really, really an excellent starting point. But as we're trying to classify this object, as we're trying to talk about the artists, and we're still generalizing, aren't we? Even talking about it within the context of Dürer's larger scope of work. And doing so, are we not introducing our own biases as we discuss this? And that's not biases when I talk about this here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think we are kind of, in general, as people, conditioned to talking about bias in a purely negative light, and that's not necessarily the case. And I want to offer you an example of when bias in particular is very helpful. And really, in this case, bias is almost synonymous with experience or valuable perspective. Your personal skills as a weaver, as a seamstress, as a brewer, that body of experience you accrue, that's biased within its own term, but that's not a bad thing, right? That's actually a very helpful thing. To give a really firm explanation of how this might be helpful, and that happened a couple of years ago, I want to talk about this portrait, which is of Duchess Eleonora di Toledo de' Medici by Bronzino. And I want to talk about my wife. My wife has been a Scadian. Fede Di Fiore is her name. She's been in the SCA for, I think, about almost 15 years now, and she specializes in Italian dressmaking. And as she was going through her research a couple years ago, working on a new set of sleeves, she came across this author named Janet Cox-Rearick, who is kind of a giant in the field of Italian art history. And she's reading these articles, she's finding her context, kind of like we discussed in the first slide, and she notices this portrait that there's an interpretation that she doesn't agree with. Perhaps you can see in this portrait, between the top of the sleeve cap and the shoulder strap, that there's a gap there that you can see the blue and white in. And Cox-Rearick said that this was a lining. Now, that's not a poor interpretation, but Janet Cox-Rearick has not been a seamstress in her career. Her interpretation was based entirely on painting. And if you were sitting in as a new SCA person wanting to get into Italian, you may think, because this very important person has written this very good article, that perhaps you would also need to line your sleeves always, or your sleeve lining might be in that kind of situation. Now, my wife, who has a BFA in painting in her own right and has been a seamstress for 15 years, looked at this, and with her bias of Italian garmentry, looked at it and said, that can't possibly be there. That has to be the chemise. This garment is structured thusly that it would have to be there. And when she presented her reasoning at a local big competition in Ethelmark called the Festival of the Passing of the Ice Dragon, most folks very much agreed that perspective of the author of this article and the Cox-Rearick she had lacked a bias towards sewing. She had lacked a bias towards garment construction that my wife and many Scadians have, and are able to pick out professionals when their points are false. This kind of experience is not necessarily a bad thing. And as you grow in your research, as you learn to ask these questions, having that confidence to know when you can make those critiques is a great way to also work yourself out of problems you may encounter. Because as a professional archaeologist myself, we have narrow biases sometimes, and we have to ask people for help. I ended up deleting this slide, but for a long time, archaeology didn't know what a spinning whorl looked like or was. We kept finding these little round discs with holes in it everywhere, and we had no idea what they were until some local person picked it up and said, oh, this is for spinning, and demonstrated how to use it. Archaeology is filled with stories like that. So one thing you can do in your research, as if you are that person who is, I'm frustrated, I don't know where to go, I am thinking I'm going to quit, is to come back to, all right, I have this background, I have this firm footing, what do I know? And have confidence in what you do know as you move forward. Not doubting yourself is as important to research as is the ability to take criticism and know when you do need to change. So let's consider our second set of questions, shall we? Let's talk about the people here. Because we talked about the objects, now let's talk about the people, because all objects are products of people and used by them. It's an important thing to consider. This is a set of artifacts recovered from Burqa. We have brooches and bead strings. We have medallions. We have carved, I believe, whalebone combs here, though it could be another kind of bone. Please don't quote me on it. There are two sets of questions that I really want you to consider when we look at, especially objects that are of ornamentation or things that are made by people for use by people. And there's a word I want you to take away from this talk, and it's called use life. And the use life of an object is from the moment it is conceived of and created to when it enters the place of sale to when it's purchased, the whole life of it until it's broken or discarded. This use life is a really excellent way to look at the timeline of the life of the object and consider all of the hands that touched it, the ones that created it, the ones that sourced the raw material, those that sold it, those that purchased it, those that maybe gifted it later on or modified it or fixed it. All of these hands are perspectives that you can use in your research to evaluate gaps or perhaps change focus to focus specifically to develop, both to look out for different sources, but also to develop the richness of your historical background. You can this is also a really good kind of truth sensing technique in your research when you're looking at, for example, oh, I think this artifact was made this way. And then you go to research the people that made that and you realize, oh, it couldn't have been made that way. My hypothesis is already wrong because I've expanded my knowledge base. Considering the hands that an object passes through helps expand your knowledge base to be able to accurately, if you're in the sense of raw recreation, like you're going to cast something, it informs the method by which you cast. It also informs you by the complexity of the project, and then allows you to say something about perhaps the second set of questions here, which considers the people themselves, not just the professions, right? So if you are looking at perhaps one of these brooches up top and you're considering all these hands that worked this object, or these hands that this object passed through, and you try to do it yourself and you're not doing so hot, and then you're realizing, wow, these people were incredibly skilled. That's an interpretation grounded in fact, like we've been talking about. That first set of questions just gave you a framework to broaden your own knowledge and understand your research on a more thorough and personal level. And the second set of questions, which branches off of the first, is exactly in this vein. It wants you to consider what we can ask about the people who use this. Can we talk about their skill? Can we talk about their professionalism? And even more so, what can we talk about in terms of if you are imagining this person at a marketplace, right? And they're going to buy this object, what kind of person would buy this object? What person in particular would want to buy this object? What would it say about them? And that's here we're getting into questions about, like, what can we talk about in terms of social class or gender or specific agency of people who would be using these artifacts in the ancient past that we're bringing back to life. And this is one of the things that I really wish to share with you guys, is that one of the greatest things about archaeology and the SCA by extension, which practices several forms of archaeology through hobby, is the idea that you want to give a voice to the people in the ancient past. And your ability, your practice of getting better at research, your practice of considering these objects, of considering the people, is exactly giving that voice. And it's wonderful to do. And when we're considering these sets of questions, if I were to say that, what is my favorite set of these questions that we're talking about today, this second set about the people, I think, is one of the most key points and one of the things that keep the magic in the SCA alive, as well as in the practice of archaeology. But this kind of this leads us into the third set of questions, which is also, it's people and objects, but it is a lot about people. And it starts with the premise of, so people A had a thing within period, and it was documented. And then people B lived right next door, but there's no documentation. Are you then able to say that people B had that thing in period? Can you suggest it even? And that's, it's an interesting question. And some folks would say no, but there is a way to go about doing this, especially if you're lacking extents and you're lacking sources on those people. You could, it's kind of a outside looking in metaphor of considering the difference of what goes on inside any given house and what anyone looking through the windows might see. In that incomplete picture of what you can see through a window, could many of those pictures be stitched together to form a complete one, or give you a sense of a perspective that you may want to consider as you're going through your research background, your documentation? And there are several angles to take as you're trying to work with these areas that may be blind spots in history. I have pulled up this map of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and its periods of expansion because it is the area where my research into Krupnik, which is it's a honey cordial, again, I have to focus on. And unfortunately, this area, for a number of reasons related to late adoption of Christianity and therefore having a long period of oral tradition and not much of a written one through traditional religion, to later problems with being the focus of the Northern Crusades, to falling under the domain of the Iron Curtain and Soviet treatment of archaeology, which is a whole nother discussion entirely, and we're not going to look at it there. This area is a huge blind spot, documentably, for any place and period. And there are others like it within the world. And that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we don't work with the SEA. We don't try to do SEA things in these areas. Like it should not be considered a no-go, so to speak. But we do have to be careful in rectifying them. And there are ways that blind spot, and there are ways you can do it. Best example I have of this was recently, within the last year or so, because pandemic recently is a whole year, it feels like. One of the best pieces of research I got for my Krupnik projects was a book about Rus to later Russian diets and how they developed and how they developed and specifically the people they interacted with within their trading sphere. And by luck of the draw, there was a lot of trade with early medieval and high medieval Lithuania. And there were many references regarding trade of grain. There was a really wonderful reference about merchants in Moscow having a very low opinion of Lithuanians because they were apparently all smugglers who drank way too much rye liquor, and they always stunk of spirits. Like, there's little pieces of color that you can get from that outside looking in perspective. And even though it's a glimpse through the window, whether it's through like this book that I found that discussed trade manifests or court records or palace records of consumption or legal decrees regarding the sale or use or commodification of sumptuary laws come to mind about if we're going to talk about Italian fashion, legal decrees are a really great way to look at the development of Italian social mores through sumptuary laws. You may also look at, I was trying to trace back how early mead was in an area, and one of the earliest sources I found was a discussion about exactly how drunk a specific treaty council got on barrels of mead. And that was the firmest date I could put back into, I believe it was the 12th century, for being able to talk about, there's definitely honey liquor related production in this area. I'm not going out on a limb. And I mentioned going out on a limb, and we'll go back to this house metaphor here. because though your house might be next to your neighbor's, right? It's probably not the same. And yet historians often have to characterize cultures in a general nature, or using that last set of questions, discuss, oh, well, this was in a similar culture area. That means it's probably somewhat similar, right? And you have to be really careful that, because adjacent cultures are not necessarily like cultures. Um, for example, if you wanted to talk about the rising middle class of Warsaw, Poland in the 1600s, at the start of that, the rising middle class, we are comparing bureaus, merchants, guildsmen, and bankers all at once. And that's a lot of different professions, not even to say you haven't yet considered the differences in that possible middle class between those who are Christian and those who are Jewish. That kind of generalization is definitely a useful tool to use, but it can be incredibly reductive. I'm very fond of my resources and my research. They have been, quite frankly, water in the desert in some cases. But I have often, and I would give this caveat to you if we're going to use that previous set of questions, that you must be careful not to do this hand wave of sameness, because you will overextend and possibly even say something that is easily disproven. I'll go back to my Warsaw discussion there. If someone were to make a statement about this quote unquote middle class and what conditions were like for them, and then presume their entire research paper off it, the first thing I would ask is, well, please discuss the difference between this class with respect to those that are Jewish and those that are Christian. And if they cannot do that, if it's not in their research, that whole thing is now invalidated from the get-go. In your own research, that kind of caution to not overgeneralize, not overextend, not use that glimpse through the window in a house to say something too far out of line, is something I think is very important here. You really have to contextualize responsibly. And a very easy way to do that is to talk about, well, this was like, in my own research, I would say, in this area, we know that these existed and we know that this had context, so it was probable. It was very likely, though not directly proven. Because really, it is a beautiful story to talk about what you think might have happened or be the case in an area based on all these external lenses and this context you can talk about. But we are indeed in the SEA, and this is also germane to my professional work as well. You have to be careful about what you can say that's provable and what's not. If it's conjecture, it has to be stated that it is, and ultimately it is just a story. So as we're evaluating these different stances to take, consider too that when you're going through your research, if you're struggling, have you overreached somewhere? Is that why you're struggling? Because you're suddenly found yourself in a space where within your research, you can't find support anymore. Why is that? Maybe you've overreached. Maybe you need to check back there. So this is also a very useful tool to self-correct as needed. Our fourth set, and this is our final set of today. Let me just allow me to check the time. We're doing all right. Our fourth set of questions we want to ask is essentially a theoretical Occam's razor. And if you're not familiar with Occam's razor, it is a statement that basically says the simplest explanation is likely the most true. Different interpretations, your mileage may vary. And in this discussion, we've talked about the questions that we can and we should ask of our objects and our people. Let's maybe consider now the ones maybe we shouldn't ask. And this kind of is in line with our discussion of not overreaching or not overgeneralizing it with that hand wave of sameness. maybe we need to look at possibly what is the most, I did not mean to do that. There we go. What is the most simple interpretation you can make about any given object or any given piece of art or any given document? Let's consider all the question sets we've discussed so far about the structures of the objects themselves, the people who would have created them, and the people who would have selected their use. Let's consider all those questions and apply them to this knight fighting a snail. What can we say really about this knight fighting a snail? What can we ask about maybe the person who drew him has a prejudice against snails? Maybe we can say that this knight's religion is actually related to snail banditry or something of the like that makes it is his sworn duty to kill snails. Or we can use this theoretical Occam's razor and suggest maybe it's just a lovely drawing. Maybe it is just a bit of medieval humor. And this may seem to some of you that this is kind of silly. Like, of course, we're not going to conjecture about the religion of the knight on the horse fighting a snail, but academia does do that. I wish I could say that they don't. But I have read some very silly papers that basically amounted to two people with flagpoles yelling at each other from opposite hills in an academic paper form. And it was about stuff like this. It was about my interpretation versus your interpretation and which one is more valid. And ultimately, that's not really, you don't need to have necessarily that fight. You also maybe don't need to make the interpretation of in the first place, because both of, to go back to my archaeologists yelling on the hill, both of them had reasons to think they were right. They also did not have enough information to prove the other was wrong. And this kind of set of questions also considers bias, and those archaeologists bias towards themselves of thinking that they were right and they had the right interpretation. And I would argue they needed to correct their overextension. And perhaps you or I in our next steps in our research also need to consider the most simplistic interpretation and correct any overextension, and perhaps even consider maybe we've taken the wrong tack. Because sometimes we get very deep into what we are really passionate about, right? We've chased this rabbit hole so far, we've forgotten where we've come in. And we're out on a limb and we've got no climbing harness. And in this situation where maybe you've recognized it, maybe you're starting to think to yourself, well, Cass, maybe you do have a point. Perhaps I have overextended on this researcher. Now suddenly you're, oh gosh, I have gotten into a point where I'm deep in the weeds. And you do need to correct. You're like, oh yeah, Freud, a cigar is just a cigar. It's not all of these pages that I've looked at, that I've written, the time that I've consumed. Perhaps I went too far on this, and then you freeze. You freeze because you're looking at the entirety of the time you've spent. And perhaps you're a little sad about it. And I want to use a slide to talk about that, because one of the hardest things to do with this fourth set of theories is directly tied to what's called sunk cost fallacy, which is exactly what I described. You're looking at all the time you've spent on this thing, and you're telling yourself you spent too much time in a particular direction. This feeling's a liar, though. And truthfully, it's one of the biggest liars in research out beyond imposter syndrome. There is no waste of time in learning in this hobby, or even in my profession, or in any profession. There is no arbitrary figure that decides for you what is too much or not enough time. It is the hardest skill I pick up, and frankly, one that I believe is a component of mastery as you develop, to recognize your own agency and what you want to do and how you spend your own time. And it's very, very hard to look at that and to be like, oh man, because we do really care about our art, right? We really care about what we do and we want it to be right and we put this effort in. But you also sometimes have to look at it in totality and erase your art. Um, I'm going to talk about my wife again because she's very topical to this discussion. Um, my wife, who is a professional artist and graphic designer, is quite fond of saying you can't be precious with your art. One line perfect will not make a piece what it needs to be. And if this piece doesn't serve the purpose in its creation, it's not worth it, regardless of the time spent. Whether you are creating a commission like my wife is, or often does, or creating your own happiness and advancement within your hobby, this advice applies equally. If your documentation, if your project, if your art is not serving you, if you're looking at it and you're going, man, I need to correct it, but I don't know if I can, you got to erase your art. You got to Occam's razor your art. You have to cut it down and you have to start back again on that firm foundation of what you know and work forward. It's very hard to do. I did it with this PowerPoint, actually. I had a whole set of a whole 20 slide PowerPoint. I did it. I felt super confident about it. I ran it to my friend who is the seneschal in our local shire, and I really respect her. She's pretty much a mentor to me in our research. I showed it to her and she said, "This is awful." She said, I was too close to it. It was too academic. It was not personable enough. And I wasn't explaining things well. It was really hard to take because I really liked that PowerPoint. But then as soon as I saw it from her perspective, I was like, oh God, yeah, this is going to put my dear friends and hopefully new friends to sleep through my class. And I needed to do that. I cut it down. It was ruthless. It was hard. I was very cranky about it the next day, but sometimes you can't be precious with the things that are supposed to bring you happiness. If it's not serving you, if it's not serving its purpose, cut it down. When you're deep in the weeds, the best tool for you is a weed whacker, not a pair of binoculars here. And that serves your research as well. So we're wrapping up here, and there's a couple more slides. And after all this time I've been talking to you, all this time that we've looked at these question sets, we've considered the objects that we can discuss, what is the essential question? And that is when you go to examine these sets of questions, look at them in whole and ask yourself, what does this set want you to consider? Research, like this 20-sided die I have put up on this slide, is a game of rolling your project along the facets of this die and seeing what you can see through a different plane, through a different way that it lands, right? If you're stuck in your research, don't give up. If you're stuck in a dead end, don't give up. Hopefully, this class has helped you understand a new direction and a new perspective, a new face on the die that you can look at with your work and make a change that helps it grow, or perhaps gives you a eureka moment that you can be like, oh, I understand the source better that I didn't before. Even without this class, when you consider a project that you want to make, it is never a bad idea to start with what can this thing tell me, and does it want me to know about the people who use it? Starting there for your context is never ever a bad starting spot, in my opinion and in my experience. So that's been a lot. And we've talked about how we might apply these question sets in smaller situations or perhaps in specific situations, but let's put one object up and let's consider all of the questions we can ask of it now that we've sat through this PowerPoint very gamefully and you guys are ready to go. So let's consider the weasel head. What questions can you ask about this weasel head? Some of you may know what this is. But when we look at the enamel, when we look at the detail, when we look at the gems on it, can we see the hands that created this weasel head? Can we look at can we ask ourselves a question, and maybe you did yourself as I put up this image, who on earth would buy this weasel head? Who would commission this weasel head? For what purpose does the weasel exist? Perhaps even more, you wonder what kind of system gave rise to the creation of this weasel head of solid gold and enamel. Why would anyone put that much expense into this lovely weaselly creature, right? We now have you've been given an object and you have a whole idea of, well, here's a goal I can take in this research as I look at, this weasel head that this person made me look at 9:45 in the morning and made me think about questions I can ask it, like it's some sort of oracle of research. Sorry, y'all, but this is exactly the kind of, you've read a book, you've come across something in a marketplace, you see a friend's project and you look at a small detail and you're like, oh, that's really cool. I wonder if I could do that. What your very next step should be. What are the questions I can ask about this object? Where do I need to go next? And for all of our edification, this is an Italian fertility weasel called a zibolino. It is worn as it is a form of sympathetic magic with chaste marriage and having happy and healthy babies. That sentence probably doesn't help you very much. It certainly didn't help me when my wife started making them understand it better, but the medieval period is full of some wonderful, beautiful mysteries, and the zibolino is one of them, in my opinion. So our final point that I want to leave you with here. Let's talk about judging. I have been a judge. Many of you probably have also been judges, and perhaps you're looking at this as both a researcher and a judge, which you should be. And I have absolutely not forgotten about the description of this class, which did mention judging, even though it's coming right at the very end. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, this talk is called Bulking Up Your Research. I've mentioned fleshing out a couple times. I have received that critique in the past that I need to flesh out my research. I know several folks, both local to the kingdom, that have also gotten that feedback, and it's not been, and that's the only feedback. While it's valid to say that someone needs to flesh out their research, you as a judge now, understanding these different questions you can ask about any given project, can hopefully now better articulate where someone needs to improve. I know as I was going through and researching this, I thought about my own critiques that I had given in the past and how I could have maybe been more specific or maybe direct about what could be done, what I could do to be more helpful, to be more of a mentor to the person that I'm judging beyond, you need more here in the background. You need more context. It's not, and ultimately, we do have to be careful with not just vomiting paragraphs of what you need to do better onto a judging sheet, but being specific about, hey, you could consider the artist more. You could develop your understanding of this period in time where your project's coming from a little more thoroughly. Those are really great additions on top of things, on top of that just fleshing out comment. And hopefully with this talk, you've got perhaps maybe a better sense of how you can be more specific, or maybe how to turn the questions you might ask about your research into more constructive feedback on judging. Yeah, and that's essentially what I said. And at the end here, I've called these question sets for a reason, um, because I think that just throwing up theoretical suites and their names can be a little overwhelming. But these might be the words that you were looking for if you are thinking about how do I look up these question sets further? How do I do more research? Our first set was a discussion about structuralism versus post-structuralism. Set two, so that's structures versus the objects themselves. Set two is processualism and post-processualism, another set dueling pair. The set three, where we talked about how we can responsibly contextualize and use outside lenses to get glimpses through the window. It's called textual meta-analysis, and I do have another class on that one that hopefully I will teach again in the future. And our Occam's razor set and discussion is a one of the reads for postmodernism. Postmodernism is a very huge overarching set of theories. There are many ways to use it. I have given a way that it can be applied here that I think is most appropriate to the SCA. Do be warned, though, that postmodernism is a huge school of thought if you go to look up further, and can be very esoteric and hard to follow practically if you go look up more. And beyond, I have listed a resource page here, and this is also in the handout. I would actually, quite frankly, now that you have the names of those theoretical suites, I recommend the Wikipedia pages quite strongly for the next step in looking through and perhaps immersing yourself further in these theoretical concepts. They are well cited. I personally have looked through them and I approve them. That's not true of every Wikipedia page, but these are quite good. And they will give you good overviews of each theory, as well as the people who contributed to them and their development and why they're important within the timeline. Regarding these resources in particular, if I had to recommend purely which ones in specific that I would say you really want to read, both by Bruce Trigger they are excellent and seminal books in the field of archaeology. And you may notice here there are a number of archaeological books on this slide, like they outweigh the others. I selected this on purpose. We do a lot of casual archaeology in the SCA, and I ultimately believe that to recreate an artifact is to understand it in totality, which is one of the purest, hardest forms of archaeology to engage with, really. And so this talk has been structured largely around archaeological theory, and hopefully I've distilled it into a more friendly version than some of these books can make it seem. Because I can tell you, when I last read Trigger in my master's class, if that person could see me now teaching this class now, they'd be laughing at me, because I did not enjoy that class.
Hey, Cass.
Yes.
Just a quick note. We've got 3 minutes.
Excellent. I am just finished. So vivat to our wonderful moderator, to the organizers of the event, and to their Majesty's Trimaris, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming in and letting me ramble at you today. It was a wonderful way to start my morning. I hope you guys have come to something that you've come to an understanding that it can be helpful to you. So thank you very much. And we've got 3 minutes, so if anybody has any questions, please, we've got a short period. I might be able to take one or two.
Beautiful. Really amazing class, Cass. I love it. So where can people get your handout if they want to connect with you and talk further?
Well, I did finish it, and I did submit it to the Trimaris Royal University website, so it should be up at some point. If someone wanted to go back, or you can email me. I have it in a PDF, and I can.
Okay, could
definitely
you offer the email address you'd like to share with the folks in the chat?
Let me retype it. So, and there you go.
Perfect. All right, so everybody who wants to continue this train of thought with Cass, please do take note of the email offered to you in the chat box. And we're going to wrap up for today. But if you got any last minute questions, we can probably squeeze them in. We've got 1 minute until the top of the hour and the next class coming on in. So, squeeze in the last little bit if you want to. Otherwise, fill the time with applause.
Everybody get a cup of coffee and a snack, hopefully.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm going to hang out for the next moderator to pass the baton.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for moderating, Sophia. I very appreciate it.
You got it. Happy to help.
All right. I'll be signing off. Everybody have a lovely morning and enjoy the rest of the event. I need to get some breakfast. Take care, everyone.
Bye.